Thank you, and welcome Michael to the stage.
The first topic, as you know, is smart transit. And what we're trying to do here is take a peek into how public transit organizations and stakeholders use data to deliver a better passenger experience and to attempt to meet public policy goals in the area of public transit. We have three panelists that will be joining us today, two virtually and one in person. They are Josipa Petrunic, who's the CEO of Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. Its acronym is CUTRIC. And just to tell you a bit about the organization, this comes from its website. CUTRIC is a socially responsible, non-profit organization that spearheads, designs, and launches technology and commercialization projects that advance next-generation zero-carbon mobility and transportation solutions across Canada. Another bullet point is that also develops low-cost simulation tools that help transit agencies across Canada and the United States predict how electric buses, hydrogen fuel cell buses, and autonomous smart vehicles for first kilometer, last kilometer solutions will operate in real time on roads and in service. She'll tell you a bit more about CUTRIC in her presentation. Second panelist is Bart Costa-Cabell, who will be here in person. He is here in person. He was the Integrated Communications Supervision Business Line Business Development Director for Canada for Thales. And again, looking to the Thales website, describes in Canada, Thales is relied on to innovate for customers with high-stake goals, critical missions, and big ambitions. Our commitment to mastering digital capabilities in Canada strengthens the nation's economy through high technology jobs, investments in domestic research, and technology and solutions for urban rail, aerospace, defense, digital identity, and security sectors. The final panelist is Jen Rees-Jones, who's the senior manager in the privacy and cybersecurity group in Dentons. I won't tell you about Dentons. I assume you know. She leads project management and supports the practice group with privacy assessments and advising on controls and mitigation plans. Prior to joining Dentons in 2022, Jen was senior policy advisor at the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, where her work focused on providing feedback on privacy law reform and smart city proposals, including Toronto's Sidewalk Labs initiative. And prior to that time, she was senior advisor in the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, investigating large Canadian companies and multinationals. So just looking at the areas that each of them will speak to, Josipa will speak to the collection, banking, and deployment of zero-emission bus data, particularly related to ZEBs for public transit. Bart will speak to some of the issues raised in the recent Thales white paper entitled Smart Stations, relating particularly to the collection and usage of rail station data by public transit. And Jen, high off the ground, will speak to privacy issues related to collection and usage of passenger data by public transit. So we'll start with each of the panelists will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, 10 or 12 minutes. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions afterwards, but maybe not, we'll see. So the first presentation is by Josipa, and that is virtually. And if all works well, she'll show up on the screen. And if it doesn't, we'll figure it out.
Wonderful. I can hear you, Michael, so I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Delightful. Thank you, Josipa.
I see you and I hear you. So perhaps I'll say thank you first off. I'm not sure if I'm spotlighted just yet, but I see a green box, which tells me I am. And I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. For those of you who aren't aware, Michael Leggett helped us to actually create the structure that is QTRIC today as our honorary legal counsel for several years. And so we owe him a huge debt of gratitude as we were starting up as a technology firm. So I'll jump right into it. And just by way of segue, I'll ask if we wouldn't mind going to the first slide of the presentation. By way of segue, first I'll just say great introductory comments, Clint, from yourself. There's a whole heck of a lot of stuff we could talk about here in terms of smart cities. Everything from the fact that in Canada, we don't privilege transit through transit signaling. If we did, buses would never be stuck in traffic jams. They'd always get the first right away. We don't do that. That's a big area that's worth a whole conversation on its own. That's an aspect of a smarter city that we need to build across the country. We know that we don't issue roadway privileges. We don't have dedicated laneway for most transit in the country. And then there's a whole boondoggle and narrative of the lurid tales around autonomous shuttles in Canada. And that's a whole other narrative, willing to get into that exegesis. But it does prove that we've got a lot of issues going on. And when it comes to smart cities, in particular smarter transit or smart transit, Canada's a global country that's going to attract a whole bunch of climate refugees and migrants, but we still operate from a policy standpoint like a small village. And that's the problem. And so we've just really got to blast our way into the 21st century. So I'll ask if we can go to the first slide. By way of globalized context, a little bit of what I'm going to talk about here today, but not too much, is Clint, from your perspective, you had referenced the fact we're in this hyper-globalized world, and globalization's never been such a hot topic. One area that you didn't reference, but it does have a direct implication on the stuff I'm about to talk about, is the new NAFTA. And if you are a student of NAFTA or the USMCA and you've paid attention to any of the dispute resolution mechanisms in those agreements, then you will have a sense already that to get to an electrified public transit world or an electrified transportation world, we're going to need something like an energy industrial policy. And that's going to need to look something like subsidized electricity rates. And that's going to look like something that's probably a NAFTA dispute, because the idea of transferring electrons at a subsidized rate to Canadian domestic users and not offering that same transfer of product or service over into the United States looks like, sounds like, feels like a dispute waiting to happen. And yet that is the front line of what we are already entering into. So not having the opportunity here today to get into all of that, but open to questions about it, and perhaps we come back next year in the next 5 years to try and unpack those elements. What I'm going to walk you through today are the data pieces that underline and demonstrate all of these looming challenges ahead, and that actually exemplify to us where we are today and how much further we need to get to. They also, however, do point to a couple good news stories and give us some optimistic hope that as Canadians, small population, distributed across a massive geography, we can actually coordinate and cluster, at least in our big cities, to do things the rest of the world isn't doing and try to lead in the way that we need to be as climate leaders. So first off, QTRIC, as Michael alluded to, is a nonprofit, but we operate like a technology innovation consortium. And so basically we have industry groups like the ABBs and the Alstoms and the Siemens and the New Flyers as part of our membership. And we have the transit operators like the TTCs and the York Regions and the Calgary Transits that are part of our membership. And then the whole constellation of actors around that, the integrators, suppliers, academics, and government. And our only job is to come up with really complicated, difficult, expensive, zero emissions transit solutions to problems and try to convince everybody to deploy that technology, demonstrate it, and pay for it all. So that's pretty much our job. And in a summary, you know, it was really cheap to pollute the earth and very cheap to fossilize our transportation system. It's going to be extraordinarily complex and expensive, and already is, to clean it up. So we're trying to figure out the technology deployments that have to happen to get that process underway. So if we go to the next slide, just to give you a sense of the areas we work in, and then I'll get into the nitty gritty. We have this vision of making Canada a global leader in low carbon smart mobility. And we actually had a live discussion at the board level is, should we be a leader? You know, why aren't we okay with just kind of middle ground? Maybe we don't need to be the leader in this stuff. There's bigger jurisdictions out there. Europe's already way ahead. Yeah, but we're also one of the dirtiest countries on this earth that we're all aware of in terms of per capita emissions. And we have a transit-dependent community. So more than the United States, Canadians take transit. And more than the United States, we pollute per kilometer. So we've really got to sort that problem out. We really can't hide under a rock on this one. We're going to have to be a global leader in public transit. And then our mission is pretty much just to do it through projects. So we don't do general policy around transit. That's not our baby. What we do is technology projects and only tech projects. projects. Tech is not the only solution to the climate problem, but it's certainly a very big one, and it tends to be the blockade as well to climate solutions. So if we go to the next slide, just to give you the scan, there's 4 areas that our tech appears in. I'll just wait for the slide to flip over. There we go. So there's 4 areas that we work in. The first is zero emissions, low emissions propulsion systems. I'll mostly talk about that today. That's the battery electric buses, the hydrogen fuel cell electric buses, and the electrified autonomous low speed shuttles. The second is we do work in autonomous shuttles specifically for first kilometer, last kilometer solutions and building out the smart infrastructure on the traffic lights. The third is all the data that goes with it. And I can talk a lot about that. The pre-data, predicting how it should happen, the in-service data, actually performance monitoring, and then the post-service data of allowing everybody to have visibility into one another's systems. It's a brave new world. I'll explore a little bit with you here today to just demonstrate the culture shift underway in transit. And lastly, layering on top of it, it's all hackable. So basically what we're looking at right now is, oh boy, you know, the buses are hackable, the chargers are hackable, the electrolyzers are hackable, and the transit system essentially has never had to accommodate cybersecurity measures before, certainly not at this level. And we're not talking about hacking of emails. We're talking about hacking a bus into a charger to shut down Toronto Hydro. You know, that's what we're looking at here. And it's a very real possibility because the standards just aren't there. Another story for another day, but it does overlap with the whole data picture. So I'll ask you to go forward to the next slide and I'll give you a bit of the narrative. So first off, there are 3 parts to this data story, and there's a 4th part of what's looming in the future. Happy to hear about the sandbox being up and running because we are looking at the sandbox as possibly a place we go to get some incubation support and analysis for some of the next big things. And I'll end on that in a moment. So the first element of data in the public transit world is rewind the clock a few years, 2016, 2017, electrification was becoming all the rage. Barack Obama had initiated the revivified CAFE standards in the United States. Although General Motors was still trying to sue California, that was starting to wane down. And even though Donald Trump was still president and trying to undo the CAFE standards at that time, eventually we got back President Biden, or we got installed President Biden, who undid all of that work. The lawsuit stopped. And so sure enough, in the last 5 years, we had all of this discussion in California that seeped into Canada about all of these electric buses that should be deployed ASAP and yesterday. And we have a presidential system in the United States that's not backing down on it right now. California has surged ahead despite efforts at lawsuits, and Canada has pretty much followed suit. And so in terms of a policy landscape, what started to emerge in 2017, 2018, and especially 2019 under then Minister Catherine McKenna was we should have 5,000 electric buses on this road by 2025. And it seemed like there was a half a decade to figure it out, which in transit terms is like dog years. It's nothing. So 5 years is pretty much tomorrow because of the time it takes to work through a city and a city budget to buy stuff. And by the time that stuff is made and it's delivered, you got 3 years. And that's assuming everybody's on side on day one and that there's no convincing that you have to do. So the problematic in 2017 was nobody actually knew how many zero emissions buses were on the road. Easy to throw out a number like 5,000. Well, there's 15,000, 16,000 buses in Canada, just like regular 40-foot transit buses. I'm not talking about coach buses and other kinds of buses. How many actually were on the road? And the answer is nobody knew. Nobody had an answer. There was no place to go get that data. Nobody was counting it. So the first place we started was a database around how many electric buses are on the road. And if we go forward one slide, I can let you know that that has fed into a massive planning effort at the federal level. And what this has allowed us to do in this database is we started surveying and collecting all the data. Good news is there are electric buses on the road in Canada. Bad news is there are very, very few of them. So 2022, we're right now about 212 electric buses actually on the road. There's a couple thousand that have been promised right now that should be hitting the road by 2025. If everything goes according to plan and there's no more supply chain constraints and the price of batteries don't go up and inflation stops. So if that all happens in the next 3 months, we might have about 22 to 2,300 electric or hydrogen fuel cell electric buses on the road in Canada, about half of the goal that the federal government had set out. And that's a stretch. It's more likely we'll be in the 1,500 zone. And a lot of that comes from the fact that the planning hadn't happened. The stuff is expensive. It's complicated. complicated. Transit agencies don't have the folks on the team to plan it all out. So when we started putting together the ZEB database, the first thing was we went to the federal government and said, are you aware of how bad the problem is? And now that the government's aware of how bad the problem is, through Natural Resources Canada and Infrastructure, they did develop with us this 8-step plan for all the transit agencies in the country that says, how do you get from zero, you've got nothing, to you have a fully electrified system. And I won't go into all the details, but you can see it goes from strategic focus to actual data analytics and feasibility analysis to cost analysis, procurement, and out the door. Once you got the stuff on the road, now for the first time ever, federal transit money is tied to agencies actually doing performance evaluation post-deployment. That's a new big data area for transit. If we go to the next slide, I'll tell you about the second stage in the data planning. So that's the figure out what you need from a country standpoint. So what do we need to get to where we are, or get from where we are to where we want to be, which is a whole heck of a lot of planning and a lot of money, a few billions of dollars per year, which is why you might not be surprised to hear the federal government has announced not only $2.75 billion for zero emissions buses, but as of 2026, $3 billion a year in permanent transit, where the bulk of that money will be for zero emissions. In fact, I can bet 100% there will be no allowances for diesel purchases in those permanent transit funds. And even hybrid diesel buses are a big open question mark at this point. So a massive amount of money, massive transformation. So that's all great. The problem is money doesn't solve all problems. And 4 years ago, folks would say, well, the money is the problem. This stuff is expensive. Put all the money you want in the world on the front, on the table or the desk of a transit agency. And in 2016, 2017, and 2018, they didn't know what to buy with it. What do you buy? Do you buy a bus with 200 kilowatt hours or 600 kilowatt hours, a charger of 450 kilowatts or 100? Do you put it at your depot? Do you put it on the road and rip up streets and install a charging unit and a transformer underground? What do? Do you go find some electrolytic hydrogen from a source that doesn't exist and try and figure out how it's going to get across the 401 to your system? Like, where do you start? So what we convinced the government of is you've got to pump some millions of dollars into feasibility and planning studies. And they did that. So this year they announced a $10 million fund that we manage. And from that, we created a nonprofit data-oriented consulting service. And it does all of these things in this circle for every transit agency in the country that wants it done. And it pays for the cost of doing it for them. If you go forward to the next slide, you'll see there's some of the agencies we're working with right now, apart from the big study we're doing for Natural Resources Canada on the hydrogen supply chain electrification. Some of our top clients, TTC, Brampton, TransLink London, these are large agencies. Some of them have subway and they have electrified transit, but they didn't actually have a feasibility and planning team. And just to give you an example, when TransLink launched its first couple of electric buses and overhead charging systems with us as a demonstration trial, they originally thought they might need 4 people on the team. That team is now over 20 people. TTC is very similar. They thought they needed a few people on the electrification team. That team is now dozens of people large across the entity to manage their first 60 buses. So it's a whole labor overhaul. There's no going halfsies. You basically have to overhaul your whole thing, and everybody on your team has to become best buddies with science. There's no getting away from the math or the economics anymore. Transit is a hub of science and data-driven, evidence-based decision-making now. There's no other way, because electrons don't care about you. They don't care about us. They are not energy dense, and these systems will run out of power if they are not properly down to the last electron planned out, which has just never been the case in transit. You were able to power your bus up a hill with heating turned on, accelerating, pumping out diesel fumes, and not have to care because the price point of carbon was so cheap. So that's the second part, is predict the demand. And when I say this, I mean, we literally go to every block, every route, every bus, every rider, and we calculate out with the transit agency every single minute of the day of every bus in their fleet, every day of the year, and then tabulate how much energy do you need, where do your chargers need to go, how much hydrogen do you need, where will you get it from, what's your ROI, what's your ultimate total cost of ownership, and how much money do you need from the feds to make it all work. So that is the stuff that's happening now across agencies, and those are just some of the ones that are doing it. Now, to conclude, if we go to the third chapter of the data, so we've got the planning, we've got the goals, we've got the money, and then we do all this feasibility stuff that says this is how you're going to electrify. The next step is put a logger on it. And it was incredible to me not coming from transit. I was in La La Land because I entered transit thinking, well, they must monitor everything because it's tax dollars. Almost nothing is monitored. There were so many systems that didn't have any loggers on their buses. And now, because of the energy density issue and the cost profile, we've encouraged transit, put a logger on everything, every bus, every powertrain, every charger, every electrolyzer, every pumping system. And for the first time ever, we now have multiple transit agencies in cities in this country collecting in real-time performance data. We're cross-comparing and we're able to share back with manufacturers and say, hey, you told us the charger will work at 90% efficiency. It's working at 60% efficiency. That means the bus is 30% low on power and 30% riders are out of service 30% of the day that we didn't expect. That is massive. And that is the first time agencies can now go back to manufacturers. And we've encouraged transit to start thinking about putting penalty measures into their contracts. Not only do you need data ownership measures in your contracts, which is new, transit never really thought about putting in their contract the fact they own the data off the bus and the charger. So we forced that with our members. The next is penalty measures. If your products and services that are multi-million-dollar products that you're selling to us do not perform the way you say they should perform, then there needs to be a penalty measure where the taxpayer is the winner out the door. So those are some of the data-led decision-making tools that are now in place, making their way across Canada. And I hope that I can come back in a couple of years to tell you we've been able to help transform the marketplace. We can go to the last slide, which is our contact info, but I would conclude by saying some of the larger systems, we've already seen massive changes in decision-making, from TTC to TransLink to Edmonton Transit, down to some of the smaller systems like Burlington, London, Quinte, some of these smaller systems where just having the data and having someone explain it to them has changed completely their sustainability planning. And so we're really proud of that. But as Canadians, we should be proud because apparently this is not happening at the same level among our European Union colleagues. So as sophisticated as the Europeans are, we're just a little bit smarter on this file and very happy about it. So thanks very much, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to Dentons and to IBI for this opportunity.
Okay, so good afternoon. It's good to be back in person again after this last couple of years that, as was said before, it has been hard. Today I would like to take you through a presentation in which we will show you our solutions for smart stations and the ideas that we have been working on in order to go from supervision, as we traditionally used to do, to data-driven operation, or functionalities that usually the OCC was not performing, and now it is to make all the operation more efficient and based on real data. So as you know, most of the operations, I'm going to focus on railways because that's our core business, but I'm sure this can be applied to all the other transportation means, just as Josip mentioned before, like buses or other. As you know, we need eyes to control everything nowadays. So more and more transit operators are investing in big control centers, using many systems to control, from CCTV to sensors and many others. And now they face a situation. Okay, they have many tools. They can hire many operators. They can control, or they can see many things, but they won't see everything. And they will see it separately. So right now, most of the operators focus on detection, reaction. That's how they've been working for the past few years. Prediction is starting to become a reality as well, but still communication between all these information sources is something that hasn't been happening so often. So this, as I'm saying, are the challenges that we are facing right now. Supervision has limitations. I've just mentioned that an operator can look into 10 different cameras, but he can focus on all of them. So he will be jumping from one to another. There is such a huge amount of data that they will not be able to digest everything, understand all this data, and extract what is important in all of them just by themselves. As I mentioned before, there is a big fragmentation of information sources, so they will not be able to extract all the important information. There will be silos everywhere. And all this will lead to an information that might not be coherent depending on who is looking into all the data. And finally, there is a very high number of stakeholders. And in the old times, the information was just for stakeholders. But now, as you can see, and as Josipa mentioned, even taxpayers like to have the information on how their money is being spent, or the operators. There might be different operators in the same network, and all this information should be coherent, and the same message should pass along all the stakeholders involved. So getting into the main pain points of especially focusing on stations now. Stations are getting more and more complex. So we have a good example here in Toronto with Union Station. It's a huge station. It includes different types of segments of transit. So you have subway, you have commuter lines, you have long distance, you have freight trains passing by. All this information needs to be taken care carefully, and it has to be integrated somehow. Passengers are now critical for all the operators. It's even more now after this COVID period, where all the transit agencies are trying to bring back people back to transit. So we all got used to work from home. We were told at some point that transit wasn't good because there would be too many people and it could be dangerous for our health. So now we are going back to life, and we need to bring people back to transit. Accessibility, there is a high percentage of people that has mobility restrictions that needs to use transit. Energy savings, so this is something that it's in everybody's mind, especially on operators and transit agencies. It's something that traditionally has meant a big part of their annual budgets. Business models are being more based on digital technology. You can see this now. There are important factors now connected to technology that used to be as important before, but now everybody has a phone, and if you want to get from point A to point B, the first thing you look is into your Google Maps and try to see, so what's the faster way, the most comfortable way. You can choose depending on different factors. You can choose whatever it's more convenient for you. And finally, risks and threats. As it was mentioned before, cybersecurity is an important factor here. We all know stories about ransomware attacks, and there was a story a few years ago of a kid, 16-year-old kid, that started controlling a station in Poland because he lived just across from that. He managed to connect his home computer to the interlocking that controls all the routes in the stations. And for like half an hour, he was moving trains, or actually they stopped it, but he was able to change train routes, and nobody could understand why this was happening. So this is actually extremely important, and then we can also get to more important aspects like terrorism or vandalism. But this was just to give you an example. So as I was saying, we have been moving from supervision to integration. And especially within Thales, when we talk about integration, we are talking on a full-scale integration of all systems that are working in one network, integration of all information sources, and then the integration of these data through some tools and using, in many cases, artificial intelligence or machine learning to make sure that more and more this information will be consumed, digested, and it will help taking decisions on a further stage. So what we've been working on is a solution that provides a single interface, so what we call more technically a human-machine interface that an operator at the control center can easily see what's happening in different places, using different systems, using different information sources, as I mentioned. It will allow and it will facilitate the decision making. And we are already going a step forward, which includes a guidance on the decision process as well. So most of the transit companies have their own protocols on how to act depending on incidents or what's happening. And immediately the system will detect an issue. inform the control center, and guide the operator on the steps to take afterwards. And this is what we call data-driven functions. And these are supported by several tools and systems that we provide, and are solutions that, especially after this COVID time, we've been talking about density and how important it is. And I try to avoid linking it just to COVID solutions, but I'm sure that everybody likes to get on their way back home. And when you jump on the train, you will know that you will find a place to sit. It won't be overcrowded, and you will be more comfortable. And that's also important for an operator, because satisfied passenger, it's what ultimately they are looking for, and that's what they want as well. So just to give you an helicopter view on how we are. Okay, I'll just wrap up. So just to give you an idea on how we are working and how we are providing that these solutions based on data are applied to specific situations. So as I said, control crowding and passenger flow, it's one of them. We have different solutions for this. Door-to-door passenger satisfaction is also part of our solutions, as we are providing a multimodal mobility information source. And I will actually skip to the next slide because it will give you an idea of how we're doing. So more and more, we are providing solutions that work towards, I would say, three main goals: having coherent information for everybody, from operators to passengers, so that the passenger will have real-time information, the operator will have real information on how the operation is happening and all the incidents that might be happening. And lately, we've been using more and more sources of video analytics, which is something that most of the companies have CCTV systems on. And there's so much information here that it's not being used. And that through our digital video analytics platform, we can understand and establish trends and analyze, for example, the passenger flow, and make sure that everybody will be moving smoothly through the stations. And this, just to finish, are some of the examples of how we are working towards smart stations and making sure that customers and passengers will be satisfied on their daily journeys. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, let's really run, guys. All right, so all of the previous panelists are talking about data, and obviously, we need more data and to integrate this data in order to make the best decisions about running transit systems effectively, improving customer service, all of these things in order to drive, increased traffic. However, that said, when you collect more data and when you integrate more data, that increases the likelihood that the information put together will reveal information about what we call an identifiable individual, or basically it will include personal information. And once the data includes personal information, then there's a whole host of sort of privacy requirements that are going to come into play. So very quickly, I thought I would give some examples of the types of personal information that may be collected in a sort of smart transit system to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. I think Bart, touched on some of these possibilities. So firstly, when I think, from the privacy lens, I think about the increasing use of sensors everywhere. One example could be the connected vehicle. I think Josipa talked about, making sure that there's those sort of ownership rights for the public sector sort of transit authorities. So a connected vehicle can record a lot of information, maybe about the speed at which it's traveling, its state of, how the vehicle is doing, what shape it's in, which by itself doesn't seem like personal information, but then maybe linked with other information about, who was on shift. Maybe it starts to reveal information about a driver. So there's sort of an element of privacy that could come into play. Another example with sensors could be something like using a Wi-Fi sensor in a public transit station to collect information from mobile devices mostly for the purpose of deciding how, people travel throughout the transit station or to determine more about density. So those are the aims. But if you're collecting the mobile tracking device information, there's a possibility there that it could be linked to an individual. So that's sort of another instance of, where the personal or the privacy requirements could come into play. And then the third or the second example that I think about here is video cameras. Bart mentioned this. They're obviously widely deployed both in stations, but also on the outside of vehicles, on the inside of vehicles, for a host of reasons, including sort of security and public safety as well. So, these collect a lot of information. Obviously, they collect personal information by collecting images. But also increasingly, as Bart mentioned, you can apply, data analytics, and maybe the most privacy invasive form is facial recognition technology to these video surveillance. So this is where we're starting to move towards where there could be privacy considerations. And the third example that I have there, I've called transactional data. Really, this is passenger information, could be on and off type records or travel patterns for individuals. Next slide, please. So very briefly, what we're talking about in terms of the risks are, we think about privacy, we think about surveillance. It's revealing information about an individual, especially where they didn't make the decision to reveal the information. The second example is misuse of personal information. So what we're talking about here is collecting data for one reason that could be identifiable, and then thinking, oh, big data, how else can we use this data to make informed decisions? Well, that's fair, but under privacy laws in Canada, you have to sort of specify the purpose of why you're collecting information and stay within that lane. One example that received some sort of media attention a number of years ago was Metrolinx going out with a bid for naming rights for their GO stations. And there was some sort of inclusion of the package, but that you're bidding for was that the private sector companies could receive some of the sort of travel patterns within its stations. So that resulted in a news item, which resulted in the Ontario Privacy Commissioner, getting engaged and sort of expressing some concern about selling personal information to private sector. Now, that actually involved aggregate anonymized information. It wasn't about personal individuals, but it gives you the flavor of, what types of sort of reuse could happen. Security risks, Bart mentioned, so I'll skip that one and we'll move on to the final slide. Okay, so the main takeaway here is that personal data can be used. It just has to be very intentional. So first of all, in order to use personal information, if you're collecting, using, or disclosing personal information, privacy laws are going to apply. The question is which one? There's a somewhat complex legal ecosystem in Canada where different requirements apply to public sector versus private sector. And the requirements, unfortunately, do not, meet up. They don't mirror each other. So especially where we're talking about public-private partnerships, it can be quite difficult in order to work together in terms of use of personal information. But either way, in this case, like the Public Transit Authority that's looking to use personal information needs to make sure they have the proper legal authority to do so. The second is transparency. Transparency is a key requirement in all privacy requirements across Canada. It essentially comes down to clearly outlining what personal information will be used and for what purposes. And honestly, the best thing about transparency is it goes a long way towards establishing community trust and hopefully avoiding any of the sort of examples like I just mentioned where, people are surprised by what's happening. The third is accountability. So there we're talking about in public-private partnerships, for example, really clearly understanding who is sort of making the decision about the types of personal information that's going to be collected and making sure that they, put contractual measures in place to protect that information, like Josepha said, for sort of ownership rights on data. And then finally, and I think most importantly, data minimization and privacy by design. This essentially involves being really intentional about the way that systems are designed up front. So you decide to collect data and then you think, could this reveal personal information? If so, could we collect the data a little bit differently so that maybe it doesn't reveal personal information? So could we, do a body count sort of sensor that doesn't need to actually collect the image of the individual? So that's the sort of main mitigation factors in a fly-by manner. But I think I'll just conclude there in saying that a lot of the initiatives that my co-panelists discussed today, can be achieved in terms of improving service delivery, in terms of improving customer satisfaction. They can be achieved without collecting personal information. And so it's just a matter of being intentional about how you design these programs. And ultimately, it will lead to increased comfort for all partners to share the data if they don't have to worry about those additional privacy considerations. Thank you very much.